introduce today's CPEP speaker. So Dr. Geeta Persad is an assistant professor of climate science at UT Austin, where she leads a research team focusing on mapping future climate risks from aerosol pollution to create actionable climate data to benefit communities. Geeta Persad, she got her BS in geophysics from Stanford University, where she received the Kennedy Prize for top undergraduate thesis university-wide for her work on black carbon aerosols. So the reason I bring that back, going all the way back that far, is because that's why I first crossed paths with Geeta. We were both undergrads in the Holling Scholarship Program. So I have known Geeta as long as I've known my husband, because that's where I also met him. And I remember your presentation.
Why him and not me?
So after that, Geeta went to Princeton, where she continued working on aerosols. And after getting a PhD there, she led the science for Western Water and Climate at Union of Concerned Scientists, served as a physical scientist at NOAA's GFDL, Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, and since then, she has been, you were a Ford Policy Fellow at some point in there. She got a career award in 2025 from NSF, super prestigious. In 2020, this was also super cool. In 2021, she was named one of the 8 generation climate leaders by the Environmental Defense Fund for her work on aerosol climate interactions and their policy implications. And your work's been in the New York Times, NPR, Nature, all sorts of cool places. So I'm super excited to hear about today's talk on climate risk in a future of evolving human missions. Take it away, Geeta. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to be able to talk about the work that we're doing in our group right now, and also get your feedback and thoughts on some of these questions. I would like to start us off, though, with a little bit of a thought experiment. So I'm going to be talking about this topic of climate risk in a world where the type of influences that humans are having on the climate system are changing very rapidly, and also in a time when people's awareness of the idea of climate risk outside of the scientific community is also accelerating very quickly. So I'd like us for a moment to try to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who is not working in this building and but is aware of this concept of climate risk. So if you would indulge me for a moment, I would like you to imagine yourselves to be a water resource planner for a Wisconsin state agency. I think you have a Bureau of Land and Water Management that does your water resource management here. So I'd like you to put yourself in the mindset of someone in that position. And I'd like you to think for a moment, if you were a water resource manager at the state level, what characteristics of precipitation would you care about? So take a minute and think about that. How does the delivery of precipitation matter for you? How does the timing matter? And I'm interested to hear whoever would like to volunteer an idea. Yes?
Floods.
Floods. Okay, so one might characterize how intense your precipitation is if you want to understand floods. Okay, any other ideas anyone feels motivated to share? Yeah?
Stormwater management.
Stormwater management. Okay, so again, maybe intensity of rainfall. Maybe we're thinking also about like where is the rain falling in a catchment area, questions like this. Okay. So the reason I posed that thought experiment is because Liz mentioned that before coming to UT Austin, I was a climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a nonprofit organization that does a lot of scientific research and engagement with stakeholders, including state agencies. And one of the questions we were thinking about at that time, we were based in the Western US, working specifically with California water managers. And I come from a climate modeling background. I did my PhD at NOAA GFDL, one of our climate modeling centers, so I'm thinking about the climate system like a climate modeler. And the state of California at the time was not doing a lot of climate change planning in the water resource management and the water planning that they were doing. And one of the reasons for that is that they were looking at figures like this. So this is showing you the percent change in total annual rainfall at the end of the century relative to present day across the state of California. This is using the 10 climate models that the state of California was using in their assessment report. And what you can see is that there's, not very big changes. These are relatively small percent changes. And these dots are showing all of the places where at least 8 of the 10 models agree, not on the amount, but on the sign of the change. So whether you are getting more or less rainfall overall. And there are very few places in California where the 10 models that they were using agreed on even the sign of the change in total rainfall. So state water managers were looking at a picture like this and saying, well, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's not looking like it's going to be a very big change. So it's not worth the investment to plan for a future where conditions may be different than the past. So we started talking to water managers and saying, okay, what aspects of precipitation actually impact the way that you operate your system? And for the state of California, that might include things like the seasonality of rainfall. So in California, precipitation is very seasonal, and that affects how much irrigation they have to do, how much water management they have to do during the dry season to make sure that they're meeting demand year-round. And so we said, okay, let's look at a metric that's more closely aligned with that way of thinking about precipitation. And so here I'm showing you the fraction of our annual rainfall across the state that falls during the wet season. And you can see it's blue everywhere, meaning that there is an increase everywhere in the amount of rainfall in a given year that's falling within that wet season, which means that you now, if your total rainfall is not changing much, you now have to bridge the potentially longer, drier dry season when you have to manage your water. And the other thing you can see is that there's a lot more dots. So there is almost universal model agreement on the sign of this change, whereas there was relatively higher uncertainty for the kind of gross metric that a climate modeler might think about. We also looked at things like the health of the snowpack. So one of the things, coming back to these flood risk, stormwater runoff questions, right? One of the issues in California is when you have rain falling on snowpack, that can cause these rapid melt situations where you have a lot of stream flow and a lot of flood water. And so here we were looking at how frequently you have a situation where you have snow present and then rain falls on top of the snow. And so here again, you can see you have increases across the whole state, and there's high model agreement basically everywhere that you have snow. So this is just to get you to kind of illustrate this fact that how we quantify climate change affects the way that we perceive it, and it also affects then the sorts of planning that is done around whether planning includes or doesn't include climate change. So the work that I was doing at UCS had me thinking a lot about this sort of disconnect that exists between the work that I had been doing at NOAA GFDL, sort of generating climate model projections, thinking about the fundamentals of climate change, and then these sort of end-use situations where we're actually using this data to plan for climate risk, to make investment choices, to make adaptation resilience choices. So I just want to sort of lay out the framework that I've been thinking about for how we go from the sort of generation of climate data to its use. And I want to hopefully make the argument that there's a lot of things that we can learn by really thinking about what that pathway looks like, both scientifically and also in terms of how actionable our science is. So I think probably all of us are familiar with the idea of, we have these Earth system models, they produce climate projections, and we can use them to understand all sorts of fundamentals about the climate system, to ask all sorts of hypothetical questions, and to also understand the future. And there's a long road that goes from there to thinking about climate risk. So thinking about what is changing my floodwaters in a given place, what's changing my human health impacts in a given place, all of these elements that come together in this idea of risk. And so if I'm trying to get from point A to point B, if I'm, say, a water manager in Wisconsin, I might not be able to use these Earth system model projections directly. I probably need to do some processing to bring them down to a spatial scale, maybe even a temporal scale that is applicable for my area. And so that might tend to be done through regional climate models or through statistical downscaling algorithms that have certain assumptions baked into them. If I'm sort of a decision maker or planner at a bigger scale, like say in the EPA, past tense, I might be thinking about a bigger question like what is the social cost of emissions? And then I might take the Earth system model projections and use them to train an emulator or calibrate a simple climate model that's going to give me a bunch of sort of socioeconomic scenarios that I can use to calculate a social cost of carbon. And then these sort of processings of the physical climate signal are then going to get additionally transformed through impact models, through sectoral models, maybe your operations model for the state of Wisconsin or for the state of California, or maybe your DICE model that actually produces a social cost calculation. And then that's going to be the information that actually informs your climate risk decision. And so the argument that I'm going to hope to make in this talk and show through some of the work that we've been doing is that I think I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we can make our science both more actionable, but also learn new fundamental things about the climate system by viewing the climate from the perspective of climate risks. So kind of coming back to that example I showed from California, where if you look at these metrics of hydroclimate change that are designed based on the actual system that's being exposed, you might learn something different about, say, the level of model agreement or what the driving processes are or the level of predictability that exists than if you're thinking about it in terms of, say, total annual precipitation. And so this is something that I'm thinking about a lot in my work right now. But then the other thing that I think about with this sort of multi-step process is that this is often predicated on a certain understanding of what the drivers of climate change are and what climate change looks like. And so one of the things that I think about a lot as someone who's works on aerosols quite a bit is, are we accounting, are all forms of climate change, are all drivers of climate change created equal when we are doing this translational process? And are we properly accounting for the ways in which the mix of human influences that are driving climate change might manifest through this process differently? So I'm going to spend most of the time today focused on this second part of the questions that I'm thinking about, really trying to understand what the difference in the influence of aerosols is relative to greenhouse gases, and are we thinking about that adequately in this sort of decision-making, decision translation framework. But you'll see elements of this question of, if we look at things from the perspective of the climate risks themselves, from the impacted sectors, do we see things differently? You'll see that peppered throughout as well. So what I hope to convince you of today, and this is an argument that I and colleagues laid out a couple years ago in this comment paper, is that aerosols have been a major driver of past climate change at global scales down to local scales. And they are a major uncertainty in near-term climate forcing. So when we think about what's going to happen through mid-century, they're one of the biggest sources of uncertainty. But they are not just the opposite of greenhouse gases, and so we need to think about their influences differently and perhaps through different paradigms than we think about greenhouse gases. And I would argue that the way that we currently do that climate risk assessment translation has a lot of assumptions that are built for greenhouse gases and fail at capturing those aerosol effects. And so correcting those gaps is really critical for making sure that we're doing near-term climate risk planning appropriately. So quick primer on aerosols for anybody who's never thought about an aerosol. For one thing, we kind of think about them as being the counterpoint to greenhouse gases, but they impact the climate system through fundamentally different mechanisms, right? So at its most basic level, right, we think about greenhouse gases trapping long-wave radiation. They're doing it in a fairly spatially homogeneous way, and they're preventing long-wave radiation from leaving the Earth's surface, and thereby warming the climate system. Aerosols, on the other hand, are cooling the climate system primarily, but they're doing it largely by interacting with shortwave radiation, so reducing the amount of incoming solar radiation. And they also do it in a much more spatially heterogeneous way. So we're not talking about a sort of globally uniform blanket of these emissions. We're talking about very spatially patchy atmospheric concentrations that are co-located with the industrial sources of a lot of this aerosol pollution. And so when we look over the industrial era, we can see that the cooling from aerosols, from industrial aerosols, have offset around 30 to 50% of the warming from greenhouse gases over the industrial era. But they're doing this in a different spatial pattern and through different mechanisms than the greenhouse gases are. And so when we start thinking about how does this manifest in terms of societal impacts, and one step towards that is maybe thinking about extremes, we can see that the aerosols are very much not the reverse of the greenhouse gases. So here I'm just showing one example from some work by Bjorn Samset that shows the increase in temperature extremes per degree of mean warming from an increase in greenhouse gases versus a reduction in aerosols. So you're warming the climate system either by increasing your greenhouse gases or reducing your aerosols. And this is showing you the magnitude and the spatial distribution of temperature extremes that you get on the top and rainfall extremes that you get on the bottom. And so there's two things that you can see here. First of all, the aerosol column is generally more intense, right? So the per degree of warming, the aerosol reductions are more potent at driving increases in extremes in temperature and rainfall. And the spatial distribution is also fairly different. So you have, especially in the rainfall patterns, right, you have some regional patterns of increased precipitation extremes that are very different than what you see in response to greenhouse gases. So they are both more potent and have a different spatial fingerprint. And when we start now thinking about this sort of full climate risk framework, when we start thinking about sectors that are impacted, it becomes even, the spatial distribution becomes even more important. Because aerosols are co-located with many of the most populated regions of the world. So this is just showing a snapshot of aerosol optical depth in the atmosphere over a recent 5-year period. And then the green hatching is showing you densely populated places. And aerosols are coming from a lot of the same industrial human activities that produce greenhouse gases, but they're very short-lived in the atmosphere, weeks to months. And so they're staying concentrated near where that industrial activity is happening and therefore near where people are. And so you can see that in sort of the mean distribution of the aerosols themselves. And so to the extent that the aerosol impacts on climate are co-located with where the aerosols are, we might expect the aerosol impacts to be preferentially happening where people are located. So when we're thinking about things from a risk perspective, this is potentially going to give aerosols an outsized impact on those risks. But it's important to note that aerosols are not only a problem for the places where they are emitted. Because of how patchily they're distributed, they can also have these large-scale teleconnected effects. So this is just showing one sort of summary schematic of some of the well-known teleconnected effects that we've seen over the historical period. So the purple icons and arrows are showing some of the effects that we've seen from increases in European aerosols that happened in the first half of the 1900s. And that increase in European aerosols produced widespread cooling in the Arctic and in East Asia, as well as major precipitation impacts. So it's has been attributed to the decline of, or the collapse of Sahel rainfall during the 1980s that led to massive famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people, has been attributed to this, at least partially, to the increase in European aerosol emissions, as have changes in South and East Asian monsoon precipitation. And then following clean air regulation in Europe, these aerosols in the Western Hemisphere started to decline, but industrialization in South and East Asia caused a massive increase in aerosol emissions in those regions. And those have been implicated in changes in the sort of overall Pacific overturning circulation, large-scale changes in North Pacific cloudiness, in Australian rainfall patterns. So because of this, even though their effects can be quite localized, the remote impacts can be highly dispersed and highly dependent on the location of emissions. So when we put all of these pieces together, we find that aerosols have actually been a major driver of forest trends, particularly where people live. So this is work from my graduate student, Kayla White, that's in revision right now, that's looking at the contribution of aerosols versus greenhouse gases to precipitation trends, forest precipitation trends over the historical period. There's a lot of information on this, but I want you to focus on the places that are dark red and dark green. These are places where aerosols are dominating the total forest precipitation trends in that region. So the top row is the annual mean trends, middle is summertime, boreal summer, JJA, bottom is boreal winter, GJF. And the main takeaway here is that going from the sort of mid 20th century to the late 20th century to the start of the 21st century, aerosols actually dominate the forest precipitation trends in most populated regions throughout the entire time period, particularly during the respective summer months, which is for a lot of these places when most of the rainfall is delivered. So this is highlighting that even though we often think about climate change in terms of the sort of global mean warming, greenhouse gas driven change, for in certain places and for certain parameters like rainfall, aerosols have actually been the dominant human influence over the industrial era. Yeah.
Your teleconnection slide sort of was talking sort of from a direct radiative effect, it seems like, changing the overturning circulation. Is this indirect
It's
aerosol effects?
combination of effects. So in both cases, it's a combination of effects. So you have both direct impacts of the interaction, the ability of the aerosols to scatter and absorb incoming solar radiation, but then you also have the radiative effects from the aerosols changing cloud properties and thereby changing the radiative impact of clouds. Those then feed into changes in the vertical structure of the atmosphere and sort of thermodynamic changes, and they also can then produce sort of dynamical changes, dynamical teleconnections. So there's kind of all different stages of processes happening here and captured in these simulations. So we also see signals like this in temperature extremes, particularly where people live. So this is now showing some work that we published just last year on looking at the impact of aerosols on heat wave hazard and on exposure, so heat wave hazard where people live. And one of the key elements of this work was highlighting the fact that the spatial fingerprint of the aerosols is important for where these heat wave hazards are manifesting, and that this also changes a lot through time. So this is showing the overall change in heat wave frequency, so the number of days per year that are falling within a heat wave, in sort of the next 30 years relative to a sort of historical baseline period. And this is in response to all human influence. So as you might expect, we have increases in heat wave frequency worldwide. If you look at the contribution of aerosols to that all-force difference, you can see that it is very spatially heterogeneous. So there are some places where the aerosol changes over that time period are actually increasing heat wave frequency, and there are other places where it's actually decreasing heat wave frequency. So understanding what the evolution of this aerosol signal is going to be a modifier of how rapidly these hazards evolve at different places. And so we can actually look at that the spatial evolution of that aerosol fingerprint in time. And that's what I'm showing you here. So this is showing you the land average number of heat wave days per year. So this is the heat wave frequency metric now averaged over all land. The bright fuchsia line is the time evolution of just the land averaged heat wave frequency. So you can think about this as just the pure hazard. And so you can see that if we look from the 1930s onward, aerosols overall are having a negative effect, so they're reducing the heat wave frequency, but they have this turnover right around where we are now. So the aerosols go from sort of decelerating heat wave frequency over time to now their effect is weakening, and so the effect of the aerosol signal now is to accelerate heat wave frequency through time. We can also look at the population-weighted version of the same metric, so how co-located this hazard is with where people are. And so that's the dark purple line here, and you can essentially see that that effect is amplified where people live. So the effect of the aerosols on heat wave hazard is preferentially happening where people are located. So if we're thinking about this again from a climate risk perspective, thinking about what the exposure is, the aerosol signal becomes that much more important. And we can actually compare this to the greenhouse gas signal and look at how this evolves through time. So this is now essentially showing the effectiveness of aerosols versus greenhouse gases at driving that heat wave exposure, so heat wave frequency where people live, relative to their effect on global mean temperature. So this is sort of the effectiveness per degree of warming. And so purple is aerosols, green is greenhouse gases, and the main thing to take away from this is that the aerosol line is above the greenhouse gas line throughout the entire historical period and into these future projections. And in the present day spatial distribution of aerosols, they're about 100% better at driving changes in heat wave exposure than greenhouse gases are for each degree of warming. But that efficacy declines rapidly in this future scenario that we're using. And this is from the CSM1 single forcing large ensembles, so this uses the RCP 8.5 scenario, right? So this is likely scenario dependent, but it suggests that the ability of the aerosols to offset heat wave exposure from greenhouse gases evolves rapidly through time as the spatial distribution of the aerosols themselves changes. So this maybe highlights that what the aerosols are actually going to do over the next 20, 30 years is important for how these hazards are going to evolve, especially where people live. So it is perhaps concerning that changes in regional aerosol emissions over the next few decades is actually one of the largest sources of uncertainty in near-term climate change. So this is showing just one depiction of that from the same perspective piece that I showed earlier. And what this is showing you is the historical evolution in sort of dark orange here, in black carbon aerosol on the left and sulfur dioxide aerosol on the right, so sort of two different anthropogenic species. And then the range of different colors after about 2014 are the different current future emission scenarios, the SSP scenarios. And you can see that by 2050, the range of potential future values of these emissions is as large or comparable in magnitude to the entire growth of these emissions over the industrial era. So if we think about the impact that growth of the aerosol emissions had over the industrial era, it is perhaps concerning that over the next 30 years that signal could go to zero or it could be maintained, right? This represents a very large uncertainty in how rapidly hazards are going to accelerate, potentially, preferentially where people live. So, one might hope that we are adequately accounting for this in that climate risk framework that I laid out at the start of the talk. But unfortunately, I think the reality is that this framework in many ways was implicitly developed to estimate greenhouse gas driven risk. And there are a lot of assumptions in here that sort of create gaps or blind spots when we're thinking about this aerosol driven contribution to near-term risk. So if we think through that framework that I showed before, the Earth system models might get downscaled by, say, a local water manager through regional climate models or statistical algorithms. Well, many of the regional climate models actually omit aerosol processes altogether. If I'm a larger scale decision maker, think using an emulator or a simple climate model, often those are using global averages or greenhouse gas based scaling with something like radiative forcing. And if the spatial pattern of your aerosol is changing, this scaling may or may not actually be applicable through time. So both of these are going to obscure how the regional aerosol emissions and their changes are going to affect the sort of physical system effects that then go into the impact models. And then the impact models themselves are often built around greenhouse gas driven damages. So the way that the physical system is incorporated into those impact models is often predicated on a certain pathway of effect. And I'll show an example of that in a second. And that might neglect some aerosol specific pathways of damage. And so the overall effect is that the near-term climate risk estimates are rarely including the aerosol effects robustly, or they're just treating them as a global mean offset to greenhouse gases. And as I showed you with the exposure time series, right, that's probably a pretty poor assumption. So I want to just show a couple examples of how these omissions are manifesting. So starting with this example of regional climate models, this is an example from a follow-up paper that we did to the perspective, and there's just since been a number of other papers that show this in other data sets. But this is showing the summertime temperatures over a part of Central Europe. And what I'm showing you in the orange dots is the global scale Earth system models that provide the boundary conditions to the regional climate models. And then in green are the regional climate model simulations of summertime temperatures in Central Europe. And this is from the Eurocortex data set. So this is data that is actively used in adaptation planning across Europe. And you can see that the regional climate models have a clear pool bias in the summertime temperatures. And this is about a 1 degree underestimation of the temperature. And we also see this, the Schumacher et al. Paper also shows this for the historical period compared to ERA5 reanalysis data. And so what some of the Eurocortex regional climate model developers did is they said, okay, we know that aerosols have been declining in Europe during this time. That's included in the CMIP, in the global scale models, but those aerosol declines were not included in the regional climate models. So they said, okay, let's take one of our global models that has interactive aerosols where the aerosols are declining. So we have that in our boundary condition, and then we'll run a regional climate model, which is the data on the right, where we are going to let those local aerosols decline. And when they do that, that bias disappears. So the fact that the regional climate, and this is, has also been confirmed in a larger data set by this Schumacher paper. So not including these aerosol effects in the regional climate models was creating this bias in the data set that was being used for adaptation planning. Right? So if you anticipate that your summer temperatures are going to be a degree cooler than they're actually going to be because you're not thinking about the aerosol effects, you are potentially missing some adaptation needs. And then just to show another example of this, this sort of pattern scaling global average issue, hopefully the exposure example that the heat wave exposure example I showed you helped highlight this, but I just want to show another example from the perspective of hydroclimate. So many of you are maybe familiar with the idea of global warming levels. This is a concept that's been used widely in the IPCC reports. The idea being that you can sort of estimate climate change across a bunch of different scenarios using sort of degrees of temperature, global mean temperature change from sort of a pre-industrial baseline or a historical baseline. So you might think about, okay, here's what climate impacts look like at 1 degree, at the 1 degree global warming level, at a 2 degree global warming level. And much of the time, this framework is sort of, it's considered to be scenario independent. So it doesn't matter how you got to 1 degree of warming, this is what the impacts look like. And so one of the things that we did in the paper that Kayla is leading is we looked at what, in this case, half a degree of warming looks like depending on whether you have an aerosol contribution to that half a degree or not. And so if you, this is just showing the evolution in time of global mean temperature in response to greenhouse gases only in green, all forcings in red, and aerosols in blue. And we've just indicated, okay, where do those lines cross half a degree of warming or cooling? And so at the point where the greenhouse gas line crosses half a degree of warming, so this would be the half a degree of global warming level, this is what the pattern of precipitation change looks like. So you have wetting over most land regions, and it's fairly weak. You maybe have some drying like over Central America, Northern and South America. But if you take the actual all-force precipitation pattern at half a degree of warming, this is what the precipitation pattern looks like. So you have a much larger extent of land drying, especially over populated areas in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And if we look at what the aerosol-only precipitation change looks like at that point, at the point when the all-forcing crosses that half a degree line, we can see that most of that drying is coming from the aerosol contribution to the all-forcing. So this is telling us that the way that we get to our global warming level is going to be important for things like precipitation that then are going to translate into risks. So the fact that the aerosols are particularly good at driving hydroclimate change over land regions, over populated regions, means that this sort of global warming level type approach that's starting to be used widely is likely to misrepresent what the hydroclimate change is going to be when you have aerosols playing a large role. And finally, I just want to show an example of the ways that these impact models may also be missing important aerosol signals and are sometimes predicated on greenhouse gas-driven change. And this goes back to work that I started in my postdoc, where we were really interested in this question of how the location of aerosol emissions affects the climate response. So we've talked about the growth and then decline of aerosols in Europe and the increase of aerosols in Asia. So the spatial pattern of these emissions is changing continuously as sort of geopolitical and economic conditions change. And so understanding how different emissions from different places are is important in understanding how that spatial pattern is going to manifest in different fingerprints of climate response. So we did a bunch of simulations where we took an identical amount of aerosol that was approximately equivalent to what China was emitting in 2000 and simulated its effect separately in each of these 8 regions. And just as a very basic summary, we see sort of order of magnitude differences in the global mean effect of these aerosols depending on where they're emitted from. So this is just showing a summary of that. On the x-axis is the global mean surface temperature change, and on the y-axis is the global mean precipitation change. And you can see that we have anything from almost no global mean temperature change in response to Indian emissions based in India, all the way to almost half a degree of cooling when those same emissions are occurring in Europe. And this comes back to ways that these aerosols generate feedback processes that I won't get into in this talk, but that we were really interested in investigating in these papers and have thought about quite a bit since. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to highlight some additional work that we did afterwards, which was to take the reality that these emissions in different places produce different magnitudes and also different spatial patterns of impact or of physical system response, and translate that into the human system impacts. So we took those same simulations and collaborated with epidemiologists, with social scientists, and basically ran the physical system responses in things like aerosol distributions, the surface temperature changes, the precipitation changes, through a set of damage functions that translated those into societal impacts. So we looked at impacts on infant mortality, impacts on crop yield, impacts on economic productivity, and can then translate the emissions of aerosols from one location into a distribution of societal impacts worldwide. And I'll just quickly show you a summary of what those results look like. There is a lot of different dimensions that you can look at, as one might expect. But to boil that down, here I'm showing you for each of our source regions here. So if you take the aerosols and you put them in one of these 8 places, and then you look at how crop yield impacts or economic productivity is impacted globally in the first column, or is impacted in each of the other 8 regions in the columns, you can see the sort of spatial distribution of how aerosol emissions in one place affect societal outcomes in other places. And I'll just draw your attention for right now to the global signals here. So you can see that if you put the same aerosols in different places, you get, again, order of magnitude differences in the global impacts on crop yields. So Indian emissions produce global crop losses, while European emissions produce global crop benefits. With economic productivity, there's sort of more uniform benefits to GDP from the cooling from aerosol emissions, but you can see that the extent of that is different, and the way that it manifests globally is very heterogeneous. But the main salient thing that I want to pull from this related to our climate risk discussion is that the way that the aerosol signal is integrated into these is actually quite important. So one of the things that Jennifer Burney, who was one of our collaborators on this, had done was build a crop yield model that was capable of thinking specifically about the influence of aerosols on crop yields. So just to illustrate that, here I'm showing you those total crop yield impacts from emissions in each of the 8 regions. And so this is the thick columns here are the same as that first column of global impacts that I showed you before. But then each of the narrower columns is showing you the contribution from one of the physical environmental variables that go into this crop model. So precipitation, temperature, aerosol optical depth. And I'll just draw your attention to the US as an example. So the damages from increased aerosol optical depth, meaning you have more aerosols in the atmosphere, they're attenuating solar radiation, that's reducing the light available for the crops and reducing crop yields. That the damages from that aerosol optical depth effect counteract the benefits that come from the cooling that the aerosols are producing and result in a net negative effect of emissions, in this case in the US, on crop yields. So if I were building a crop model that was only thinking about greenhouse gas driven impacts on crop yields, I might think about temperature, I might think about precipitation, maybe I'd think about CO2 fertilization. I would probably not be thinking about the effect of light availability from changes in aerosol optical depth. And so this is showing that if you are missing that unique signal from the aerosols, you're going to probably end up with a difference in the sign of impact that you think that this is going to have. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that there are blind spots here that we should care about. And so I don't like to just complain, I would like to hopefully have some solutions also. So one of the things that we are trying to do right now to kind of help build a path forward is through the Regional Aerosol Model Intercomparison, RA-MIP. This is a project that's been underway for a couple of years now and is starting to produce data. It should be hopefully publicly available over this summer. But the idea here is to really build a quantitative base for understanding, isolating the impact of this uncertainty in aerosol emissions, the role that that's going to play in near-term climate risk. So the way that we're doing this is through a set of coupled simulations through 2050. There's 10 participating models. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking the SSP 37 baseline, which is the high aerosol emissions baseline future emission scenario. We're taking that SSP 37 world and sort of all 4 things, and we're only swapping out the aerosol, the industrial aerosol emissions, for the SSP 126 scenario, which is the lowest aerosol emission scenario. So we have simulations where we do that reduction globally and then in individual regions. There's also some other more complex effects simulations being done, but it really lets us isolate, okay, how important is this aerosol signal for the way that we characterize near-term climate change? With the hope being that we first have to establish that this is an effect that is big enough to warrant investing in improving the rest of our climate assessment pipeline, right? Because that takes time and resources. And I'll just highlight one of the main results that we've been building from this. Again, bringing back in this idea of thinking about things from the perspective of climate risks. So one of my graduate students, Sebastian Utama, who is a former undergraduate student of Tracy's actually, has been looking at the effect of these near-term aerosol reductions on fire weather risk. So the meteorological conditions that drive, that sort of precondition vegetation for wildfire activity. And so we can use these RA-MIP simulations to understand if we look at the SSP 37 high emissions future, this is high emissions of aerosols and greenhouse gases, and compare it to low emissions future, SSP 126. This is a world where we mitigate greenhouse gases and we mitigate aerosols. What is the contribution of aerosols to the difference between these 2 worlds? So the first thing I want to highlight is if we look at the projected mid-century change in high fire danger days, so these are days with fire weather that is above sort of the National Forest Service cutoff for wildfire risk compared to a historical baseline, and we look at what this high fire danger change looks like in a world where we don't mitigate at all, greenhouse gases or aerosols, and a world where we mitigate everything, right? So we're really sustainable here and we don't really care here. The fire weather risk looks almost identical in these two worlds. And that is very disappointing, right? So we take all of this mitigation effort and we end up with the same climate risk in this metric. And the reason for that, we can use the RAWMIP data set now to decompose that into the effect of aerosol emissions reductions between these two worlds versus the effect of the greenhouse gas reductions. And essentially what we find is that the aerosol effects, we can just look at the global totals here, they almost entirely counteract the benefits of the greenhouse gas reductions with a similar but not identical spatial pattern. So this is highlighting that understanding what trajectory these aerosols take is going to be really important in determining if we reap the societal benefits of greenhouse gas mitigation. Or conversely, how ambitious we have to be about greenhouse gas mitigation to prevent societal damages. Okay, so just to summarize and kind of describe some of the ways that I hope to move this forward, to think about how we can enhance how we're quantifying climate risk when we both have much more societal demand for that information and also a changing and accelerating mix of aerosol, of human influence. One of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about is how we can integrate sectoral experts in how we're designing our climate metrics. So coming back to that thought experiment at the beginning, if I asked a water manager, how would you characterize precipitation statistics? What answers am I going to get and how different are they than the way that climate scientists tend to characterize those characteristics or those meteorological variables, and what new can we learn about the climate system by looking at them from that perspective? And we have some projects at UT where we're collaborating with epidemiologists, with health experts to kind of start trying to do that work. I think that will help us build new fundamental understanding of how these metrics respond to different forms of climate forcing. So this is what my career grad is focused on, is understanding if we think about these sector targeted metrics or sort of multivariate climate hazards, how do those respond to aerosols and what are the fundamental processes that drive those responses? And can we derive more predictability from that? Can we improve our extreme event attribution through that? I would love to see more intermediate tools that include aerosol effects. So I think the regional climate modeling community is already investing in this. I think there's an opportunity in subseasonal to decadal prediction as well, and in emulators to be more thoughtful about whether or not we're including aerosol signals that are important. In order to do this, especially for subseasonal to decadal prediction, there has to be better real-time tracking of aerosol emission changes, which is not being done at all right now. And I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. And then I think when we're thinking about these future Earth system model scenarios, the scenarios that we choose to produce simulations of in CMIP 7, that's going to establish the data set that sectors can use to plan for risk. So we are, by just choosing those scenarios, we are already establishing the types of futures that sectors are going to be able to plan for. So I think making sure that those future scenarios are interpretable by end users, like what does SSP 3.7 mean? How does it relate to current climate policies? I don't think anyone actually knows the answer to that. And making sure that we're realistically accounting for aerosol uncertainty as well as other rapidly evolving forcings is going to be important. So with that, I will say thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions now or later over email. So,
Great, let's thank you. And we'll just let you call on people. If you want to avoid someone, that's the speaker's prerogative,
I
right?
can't imagine that I would. Yes, Tracy.
Thanks for the great talk, Geeta, and thanks for coming to visit. I love, your kind of big picture, thinking about this from different perspectives. But, you very much are focusing on like the aerosol climate flow.
Yeah.
But actually, all of these sectors are emitting lots of different compounds into the atmosphere.
Mhm.
And a lot of the impact areas, health, agriculture, are being impacted. And I guess, to me, it feels like there's a disconnect between the climate community
Mhm.
addressing these things and the air quality community, who's looking
Yeah.
at the same sectors, the same models,
Yeah.
the same pollutants, and the same impact areas,
Yeah.
but we call them PM 2.5
Yes.
or particulates rather than aerosols.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, you didn't mention air quality at all.
I did not.
No. And so could you talk about that,
Yes.
the lenses?
So I should have remembered that you would be in the room and shown the different version of my conclusion slide where I do mention clean air or air quality. Yes. So I think there is a huge missed opportunity in the way that the air quality world and the climate worlds are divorced, especially around aerosol issues. Real-time tracking of aerosol emission changes is one very obvious place. Like in the air quality world, you all are amazing at that. And we don't know how to do it in the climate modeling world for whatever reason. We haven't thought it's important. So I think that's one place. Another really obvious place is in policy coordination. So generally with aerosol, and I'm not saying this is not how it should be done, but air quality policy is made for human health reasons, and then we take those policies as a given in terms of the climate forcing that comes from the aerosol changes. In a lot of the social impact analysis, societal impacts analysis that we've done, it's clear that the human health benefits of reducing aerosols outweigh any of the climate damages, no matter how you slice it. So I hope that we continue to regulate aerosols through air quality policy for human health reasons. However, it seems necessary for there to be more interaction between the people making air quality policy and especially the people making climate adaptation policy, so that it's clear. I see laughter about whether that's possible or not, but so that it's possible for us to anticipate how the air quality policies are going to impact climate conditions and be sort of like making those connections hand in hand. So those are just two examples that I've been thinking about, but I think the missed opportunities there are endless, and I would be curious to hear if you have ones top of mind that you wish would happen.
Well, I agree with everything you said, and I think there's barriers, but I think one interesting barrier, and I'm curious, I'll speak to part two and not a lot of other people,
Yeah.
is that you're funded mainly by NSF. NSF funds
Mhm.
climate.
Mhm.
NSF does not fund air quality because
Yeah.
that's under the jurisdiction of the EPA.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious whether you felt, disciplinary funding,
Yeah.
like winds that have blown you to frame this very explicitly as a climate-only narrative, in part to align with NSF priorities.
That's maybe a bit of a leading question, but I would say yes. So there are 3 NSF proposals whose
Yes.
work is embodied in this work,
Yeah.
in this presentation. There's also NOAA work, NOAA funding in here, but the NOAA work also is explicitly climate focused. I would say the place where there's maybe the most opportunity for overlap is in some of the climate change and health work that we're doing, where we are looking at the sort of co-impacts of heat exposure and air pollution exposure on human health. And so I think when we start getting into the risks and impact space and those funders, which are primarily foundations in that situation, then there's less, they're like, why would there even be these disciplinary boundaries? But I think that is a little bit of putting the cart before the horse problem, because when you're in the foundation funding space, you're going straight to what is the societal impact? And one of the things that we're finding with that work, and that I find exciting also, is that often we don't even have the scientific basis necessarily to understand the physical system signals that we are putting into our impact model to get out the human health impacts. And what doesn't exist is the the more fundamental funding streams to understand those like more like basic science questions. And so like that is where I think there is a clear gap, and I don't know what the solution to that is, and especially in the current funding environment. Acknowledged. Yeah, okay. Maybe start in the brown shirt first.
Sure, this is a really cool topic, Geeta, and thanks for delivering it, I guess. I don't want this question to come off as a challenge, but it's just something that jumps out to me where you say that, you know, real-time tracking of aerosol emission changes is difficult. You know, being able to predict that into the future is difficult. I mean, some of the work that I've done, even being able to look at what has happened in the past and get that accurate data as to, you know, maybe what real countries are emitting can be kind of cloistered. But with keeping that in mind as, you know, kind of the footstep, and then running that through, you know, a global climate model or some sort of model, and then taking that and then running that through, you know, like, I don't know what these societal or these, you know, social science models are. I mean, it seems like there are steps of like, you know, I don't want to say like leaps of faith or delusion or anything, but do you find, how do you, I guess, like, weigh what those end models are producing, given that there is, you know, compounding, I guess, bits
There's
of
uncertainty introduced at every step.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me think about there are a few different things I can say to that. Okay, so I will say that's one of the reasons when we were building that, going all the way from the physical system effects to the societal effects, in that project we sort of idealized the aerosol impulse that we were putting in at the start of that. So in some sense we were eliminating at least the emissions uncertainty, but then of course it's like, okay, is this model producing reasonable physical system responses? Question mark. How are the impact models working? Question mark. Okay, so there's uncertainty introduced at every step. The question is whether it is worse to make decisions with uncertain information than it is to not make decisions at all, or to make decisions with no information at all. And I think there, you are getting into questions of decision-making under uncertainty that there are entire fields around. I would argue that in order to be able to ask the question, is this information useful? Is making a decision based on this information, given the known uncertainty, useful? We have to first actually produce the data. And so if we are not taking the step of producing something that we think is realistic or to the best of our abilities, then we're not even giving ourselves the opportunity to ask that question. So I would argue we're not even at the stage yet of like knowing whether this uncertainty is too large to be actionable. But I think the case that I am trying to, or that I think is emerging from the impacts work that we're doing, is that if we take the aerosol signal as, even in the rough sense that we understand it now, the impact is, the effect on climate risk is large enough that it is worth trying to improve the fidelity of what we're producing. And that, I think, is a necessary first step to then understanding, okay, like, is it worth investing the time in doing all of these things?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes.
I think my question might be slightly related. I really like your point about the first step being showing that this is a big signal and it's like worth knowing how big and where. So I really liked your presenter technique of being like, if you were someone in Wisconsin,
wherever we are right now.
In Wisconsin, like what are the things you'd be thinking about? And I would tell you, as someone that's lived in Wisconsin for the last 5 years, that by far the most noticeable aerosol impact is from wildfires.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, like, what is the relative impact of those aerosols on all of these things? Another thing that jumped out to me was that huge AOD impact on plant growth. Like, has anyone looked into the impact of these wildfires on the growing season or that sort of thing?
I actually wrote a concept paper to a foundation on exactly that topic.
Okay.
It's not been funded yet, but I'll let you know if it
Okay.
ever gets funded. Yeah, so I would say that the wildfire impacts of wildfire aerosol on climate are one place where we don't even know what we don't know. So the way that the wildfire emissions are implemented in models is extremely rough.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many of you have followed, but like in the NCAR model recently, they found that the change in the variability that happens when you go into the satellite era and can detect the like more variable wildfires creates its own warming signal, just the change in temporal variability. Their approach was to get rid of that temporal variability. I'm like, what? Doesn't that just mean that we should be in like putting more realistic variability into the rest of the time series? But like that's the level of question that we're at with the wildfire emissions. So
We didn't know anything 50 years ago, so we don't know anything now.
okay, great. I'm glad it's getting better.
It's not.
Okay, yes, meant sarcastically. So yeah, I think there's a lot of open questions there, and I think there again, the research infrastructure you would need to have in place to answer those questions, I think demands first that we at least figure out some way of showing first order whether it's an important signal or not. And so that's kind of like the area that I'm trying to target right now is like, okay, what is something we can do with the imperfect tools that we have now to say like, is this even worth investing in? Because I think about this too with the aerosol signal. Part of what I'm trying to do with my career proposal is say, both where are the aerosols important to account for, especially if we're doing things like extreme event attribution, and where can we neglect them? Because hopefully there are places where they don't matter and then we don't have to include them. And I think that's also an important question to answer when we're like trying to do science with limited resources.
Maybe one more question if there is one.
I saw Mudra had his hand raised.
Yeah, I had a question. First of all, amazing presentation. I had a similar question to what Evan asked, but I had another question as well about your regional models.
Yeah.
So when you include versus not include aerosols in
Yeah.
the UK or Europe
Yeah.
version of the models, to me it seems that it's like shifting the whole thing in a linear way to more increase or decrease, right? That's how I interpreted that plot.
Yeah, those were like multiple ensemble runs of the same model, and
Yes.
yeah, the whole ensemble shifts up. Yeah.
So is it safe to assume that if we want to include aerosols in regional climate models for that impact, it could be a very linear approximation could be made, or do you think there are nonlinear effects that could be affecting those results? Like if I'm a regional climate model, do I just need a simple parameterization or something to improve that, or I need some more sense of interannual variability of aerosols or something?
That is a good question. I think the Schumacher et al. Paper that I mentioned goes into the mechanisms behind that in a little bit more detail. And one of the things that they do is they distinguish the thermodynamic component of that temperature change from the dynamical component of the temperature change. So like what is just like mean warming versus a change in circulation. And where you actually see the aerosol bias show up is in that thermodynamic piece. So it is, in this case, in the case of Europe, it's more of a shift in the mean warming than it is a circulation change. In other parts of the world, it has more to do with the way that the aerosols are changing the regional circulation patterns. So this is, I think, maybe is one of the ways of potentially saying, okay, here's where we need to care about the aerosols in this way, and here's where we don't. So maybe for a place like Europe, you can do a linear approximation, or simple scaling. But for a place like South Asia, you maybe need to have a more robust accounting of aerosols. Yeah.
Great, well, let's thank Geeta one more time.
Thank you all.